Hello, everyone. I'm Esra Akcan, and I'm the Director of IES at the Aynadi Center for International Studies. Welcome to the panel, Beirut Reconstructions, which is organized as part of our migration series, whose theme this academic year is Repair and Reparations. I will briefly introduce this event series and the webinar procedure, and then pass the word to our moderator. The migration series of the Institute for European Studies has been continuing since fall 2017, and it brings together panels that conceptualize migration, not only as that of people, but also of images, ideas, technologies, food, objects, and information. Among other things, this series aims to understand the historical and contemporary relevance of migration and critically acknowledge Europe's role in the history of modernization and colonization, as well as its character as an immigrant continent. The lectures and panels we have so far organized in this series include Academic Freedom and Exile, Will This Robot Take My Job?, Migration of Images, The Arts of the Immigrant Continent, Crossing the Mediterranean, Exhibiting Yugoslavia, Global 1968, Necropolitics of Extraction, Exiles in the 21st Century, Family Separation, Future of EU, and Ethics and Rights of Immigration. All information and videos of these panels are on our website, so please check our migration series page. This fall, we have already organized the panel Hagia Sophia Perspectives from Cultural Heritage. And the theme of our series in this academic year will be Repair and Reparations. Our next panel, Repatriation of Museum Objects between Europe and Africa, will take place on October 19. We are extremely proud today to be hosting the panel Beirut Reconstructions on another urgent topic that came to the fore after the deadly explosion of August 4 this year. We would like to contextualize this event in the city's urban development and the relatively recent urban reconstruction of its center after the Civil War. How, when, and by whom should the reconstruction projects be designed and implemented? What are lessons learned from the reconstruction of the city center after the Civil War? How will or should the current reconstruction make an impact on the area's use, possible gentrification, and the residents' lives and livelihoods? How can international organizations and academic institutions partner with local organizations? How should the different affected neighborhoods, some with heritage buildings, others with low-income apartments, be approached when it comes to rebuilding? So I would like to thank both the session participants and our webinar attendees for joining us in this important discussion. And let me briefly introduce the procedure for the discussion today. A protocol that I hope will allow our speakers sufficient time to share their reflections and for our attendees to participate in the discussion in a timely way. Next, our moderator, Mustafa Minawi, will introduce the panel and the speakers. And then our speakers, Eddie Haddad and Mona Harp, will make 15 to 20-minute presentations each. After that, two recent Cornell graduates, Eli Boutros and Dana Mohsen, will pose questions to our speakers for a discussion that lasts for about 20 to 30 minutes. Upon conclusion of this round, our moderator will make a selection of questions submitted from attendees over the course of the session. Attendees will be able to submit their questions for this portion by writing them in the Q&A tool that you can find at the bottom of your screen. The more direct, short, and concise your question is, the more it will have a chance to be selected. Given the large size of attendees, please refrain from writing your reactions or impressions or even thanking notes so that our moderator can sort through the posts efficiently. We expect to discuss questions that are not off topic and that synthesize thematic issues delivered in the presentations. And we hope to conclude the panel in 2 hours or very shortly after that. And let me now introduce our moderator, Mustafa Minawi, who is an associate professor of history and the director of Ottoman and Turkish studies at Cornell University that is co-hosting today's event. Last year, he held the Alfred Howell Chair of History and Archaeology at the American University of Beirut. Currently, he's a core senior fellow at the Institute for Advanced Studies of the Central European University. His first book, The Ottoman Scramble for Africa, was published by Stanford University Press in 2016. He's currently working on 2 book manuscripts, the first titled Ottoman-Ethiopian Relations and the Geopolitics of Imperialism in the Horn of Africa, and the second, Amzades in Istanbul, Arab Ottomans Experiencing the End of the Age of Empire. His latest article, International Law and the Precarity of Ottoman Imperialism in Africa, just came out in the International History Review. Mustafa, the screen is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Esra Akjan and the team at the Institute for European Studies, including Pamela Hampton and Claire Swenson for putting this together. I will be moderating the Q&A discussion with Professor Haddad and Professor Harb after they have given their 15 to 20-minute presentations each. But first, I would like to give a very brief background on the history of Lebanon for those who have joined us that might not be as familiar with the history of the country and its impact on the events that happened most recently. It will be a very, very cursory introduction. Some of the things I will mention might seem like ancient history, but in the course of the discussion, hopefully it will become clear how some of these seemingly 100-plus-year-old factors are in many ways still at play, though in radically different ways. As an Ottomanist, I should start by mentioning that Lebanon was initially carved out into existence by joining Mount Lebanon, which was a special Ottoman administrative zone, with parts of what used to be the province of Beirut and parts of the province of Syria. That was termed Greater Lebanon, and it took place under French colonial rule. Later on, there was the creation of Greater Lebanon that came to be under French colonial rule, which lasted roughly from the end of World War I to 1943. A delicate arrangement of confessional political representation was put into place under the tutelage of the French colonial rule, which assumed a religious affiliation as the main identifier for the different people that live in Lebanon. Some enshrined by the constitution, but mostly it was a power-sharing scheme between Sunni Muslims, Shia Muslims, and Maronite Christians, as well as the officially recognized ethnic and religious groups that used to be about 17. Now I think they grew. These are the officially recognized ones. There are many that are actually not officially recognized that make up a significant part of the population. It basically that mostly enshrined the power sharing structure that put a few rich families, some of them feudal lords from the Ottoman times even, others that were well-off families who would eventually establish an economic system based on banking, services, and tourism. This system worked for some during the so-called Golden Age in the 60s and early 70s. The Golden Age of Lebanon, when Lebanon was called the Paris of the East, and all of these kind of cliches. But many were left behind. So particularly many of the residents in the north of Lebanon and the vast majority of the growing Shia population in the south were left out of this boom. Add to this mix a massive Palestinian refugee population, which came to Lebanon after they were pushed out by the establishment of the Israeli state in 1948. And then another wave came with the occupation of the West Bank in 1968, and it gets a lot more complicated. Palestinians in Lebanon who have been there now for several generations are still to this day completely disenfranchised, impoverished mostly, and marginalized by the ruling elite. A devastating civil war erupts in 1974 and lasts till 1990. The factions were supported by foreign powers. Of course, the different factions were supported by foreign powers, including Israel, the US, Syria, Iran, and many others. A general amnesty was given to the warlords during the peace agreement that was signed in Saudi Arabia in 1990. There was no truth and reconciliation process of any kind. It was kind of what happened during the war was mostly swept under the rug and it was never dealt with. So it still simmers. It also gave the same warlords that were part of the civil war that basically destroyed the country the ability to divvy up the government, the different governmental ministries amongst themselves and their families till today. So the theft of government resources or state resources was aided through Ponzi schemes, if you will, supported by the Banque de Liban, and a development real estate scheme, if you will. I don't know how you would call it, but I think Professor Haddad would explain a little more. What is famously known as Solidaire, which turned downtown Beirut into basically a mostly soulless, empty, a set of beautiful high-rises with massive boulevards for the ultra-rich, and many of whom were foreign. Those that owned businesses there were only compensated with shares in this scheme, as in the Solidaire scheme, but their businesses and homes were taken away from them. More recently, with the Syrian civil war, or the war, I should say, the economy was further impacted, not least by the influx of Syrian refugees, which are estimated right now to make up to a quarter of the residents in Lebanon. So it's a huge, huge, huge portion of the residents in Lebanon right now. And they now make up a huge part of an informal, mostly exploitative work system. At this all this started to collapse early last year and came to a head exactly a year ago when protests broke out across Lebanon, which luckily I was a part of because I happened to be there during that year. It was a very inspiring movement, and it was good to see basically cynicism turn into hope as the protests grew and continued until they were suppressed by force, coupled with a crippling economic and worsening economic situation. Basically, people were trying to make ends meet. And then COVID hit and put the brakes on everything, mostly. The horrific collapse of the economic system in Lebanon continued. The extreme devaluation of the Lebanese lira meant that most people who were paid in Lebanese lira lost something like 80 to 90% of their purchasing power overnight. Last, but not least, is the blast that happened about a little over 2 months ago now, on August 4th. That devastated neighborhoods for miles, which is what we are here to discuss. We want to learn from lessons of redevelopment in the past and think through creative ways to ensure that local residents of those devastated areas, mostly historical neighborhoods, some with very expensive real estate, while others are neighborhoods that house many of the poor working people in Lebanon, including some Syrian refugees, can be rebuilt without pushing out the local residents. We are very honored to have two amazing scholars to discuss the rebuilding of Beirut after the August 4th blast, who will shed a light on exactly the questions we're looking where I just mentioned. So we have first Dr. Mona Harb, who is a professor of urban studies and politics and the research director of the fabulous Beirut Urban Lab at the American University of Beirut. If you haven't checked it out online, please do. It's an amazing resource if you're interested in urban development in Beirut. She received her PhD in political science in 2005 at the Institut d'études politiques in Marseille. She is the author of Le Hezbollah et Beirut, 1985 to 2005, which was published by Carthala and IFPO. In 2010, she co-authored a book called Leisure Islam, Negotiating Geography and Morality in Shiite South Beirut, published by Princeton in 2003. This one was co-authored with Lara Deep. She co-edited Local Governments and Public Goods, Assessing Decentralization in the Arab World, published by LCPS in 2005 with Sami Atallah. and she was the co-editor of Refugees as City Makers, an amazing resource for those that work on space in the city. I've used it a lot. It was published by American University of Beirut, and it was co-edited with the fabulous Mona Fawaz, Ahmed Gharbiye, and Dunya Salame. In addition to numerous journal articles, book chapters, and other publications that were published over the last few years, her ongoing research investigates the public domain and urban vacancies, local governance and displacement, as well as urban activism and oppositional politics. Before Dr. Harb speaks, we have Dr. Eddie Haddad, who will start. Dr. Haddad is a professor of architecture and at the Lebanese American University, LAU, where he has been teaching since 1994. He has been serving as Dean of the School of Architecture and Design since 2012. Between 2009 and 2015, Dr. Haddad received several fellowships to conduct research on modern architecture in Germany. Among his publications is the architectural survey titled A Critical History of Contemporary Architecture, published by Ashgate in 2014, which he co-edited with David Rifkin. He also published 2 books on architecture and urbanism, both in Arabic in 2014. In addition to his academic work, Professor Haddad is a frequent contributor to the local newspaper, An-Nahar, where he writes essays on architecture, urbanism, and cultural issues in general. Now, I would like to hand over the Zoom screen to Dr. Haddad, who will speak for about 15 to 20 minutes, followed by Dr. Harb.
Thank you very much, Ezra and Mustafa, for this introduction and for the invitation to discuss the difficult situation in Beirut following the major explosion of the port of Beirut. As agreed, let me first start with the, make sure the PowerPoint is working. Let me see, I have to share screen. Okay. And all right, so do you see my screen?
Yes.
We didn't go back to the first slide. So this is the first slide, basically. So as agreed with Mona Harb, I will be giving basically an overview of the areas that have been affected by the blast. We'll not be discussing so much Solidaire. It has been it's behind us in a way, and there has been a lot of press on that. So I will give a historical overview of the situation, and Mona Harb then will focus, I guess, on the questions of reconstruction and the issues of the different initiatives that are taking place. Basically this explosion has been, of course, so catastrophic in a way and has devastated large parts of the city of Beirut. I would say East Beirut in the sense of geographically. And so much so that already on Wikipedia, there's a page that kind of gives you an overview of what has happened and the political issues behind this explosion. But my first image that I would like to start with is an old map of Beirut of 1841. And this is basically, this old map shows you the supposed location of the original port, and then there's a modern port, which was assumed to lie west of Martyrs Square. This is the empty lot that you see in the middle of the picture where you don't have any urban fabric. This became later the major public space of the city. And it was facing basically the old souks of Beirut inside the medieval city walls. Those city walls had disappeared, of course, in around 1870. They were torn down. And so the city started its expansion east, west, and south. And this other map from 1912 shows an already well delimited port area with a wave breaker, as well as it shows, the expanding port, which starts to expand towards the east and to stretch all the way to Martyrs Square. This is a close-up showing basically the edge of the port area is facing the old souks, and you see at the very extremity of that page on the upper left-hand corner the Khan Antoun Bey, which was this historic Ottoman times building that was basically a caravanserai used to accommodate traveling merchants, including storage areas and a hostel. And this building, surprisingly, stayed more or less, damaged, but stayed, was still standing until the end of the Civil War in 1990, when the decision was made to demolish it. Next to it, on the left of the picture, you see the Majidiyya Mosque, which remains to this date. It has been completely redone in a way, and instead of the historic Khan Antoun Bey, the caravanserai, we have this new Zaha Hadid designed department store, which is going to open soon, I guess. This other map of 1940 shows further expansion of the port. You start to see here a zone franche. You start to see more sort of organized areas for storage, and a landfill, which is in process, which also accommodates a railroad line that reaches all the way to the port. Of course, the railroad has stopped completely before even the beginning of the Civil War, and but we see here that the port has started really in its process of expansion eastward. And this big landfill that you see is kind of almost opposite of Gemmayzeh neighborhood, which is the one of the three areas that are going to be largely damaged during this explosion. This photo of the Medawar district at the turn of the century, of the 20th century, shows pretty much what Beirut looked like up until, of course, modern times, up until the 1950s and 60s, when wide-scale demolition started to take place, and new buildings started to replace this old fabric of traditional houses with red tile roof. And this Medawar district used to reach all the way down to the water, where you have basically some beach resorts on this reaching to the coast. And all of this, of course, this whole neighborhood became completely separated from the sea by the new infrastructure of highways that reached to the port, and by the, of course, the expansion of the port itself. So the tragic map of Beirut that you have seen probably shows the epicenter of the explosion, where it happened. And given that the port has been shifting gradually towards the east, as I mentioned, this is why these areas became the most affected by this tremendous blast. There are three areas that I will maybe focus on. Of course, there are other areas in Beirut that were slightly damaged. The damage occurred in a greater sort of radius, but these are the most sort of damaged zones. And the first one is the district of Gemmayzeh that extends all the way to also Marm Khayel. The Gemmayzeh basically was a mixed neighborhood of residential and institutional buildings. A big school, which I attended, École des Frères, sits right in the middle of this district. There are also a couple of hospitals. So this is a kind of mixed sort of neighborhood that was basically spared from the destruction and the speculation of the destruction of speculation, basically, during the war, because of the fact that it was too close to the green line separating the two Beiruts. And therefore, no development happened until very recently in this district. This district basically has a lot of interesting historic buildings, this neo-colonial kind of architecture of 3 to 4 story residential buildings, as well as some modern buildings that still respected more or less the scale of the neighborhood, the alignment of the street, and rendered the district a rather coherent sort of urban fabric. Unfortunately, as the reality shows, the destruction of this neighborhood started well before the August 4 explosion. And this is due to the developers gradually buying up these properties, leaving them sometimes to deteriorate, by leaving the doors, windows open and all that, so that they would be unlisted, because these were historic buildings that had been placed on the historic register. So they would use this kind of natural deterioration process to allow them basically to eventually demolish them and replace them with towers. And of course, big interest, including the infamous banking sector, collaborated on this process of gentrification of these neighborhoods. And another strategy they would use is to buy several parcels that then would be merged into one big parcel to allow them to build larger complexes and go higher even in terms of the height, which, by the way, was recently also kind of this limit on height was removed, but before it had to be subject to the size of the lot. This zone was then basically, these are again shows you some of the already gradually encroaching towers within those within this neighborhood, despite the fact that some people may have mentioned, this district has been since 2005 placed on the historic register, and therefore kind of was supposed to freeze any development in this area. But there are always loopholes, there are always pot de vin that people can spend and basically get an exemption to allow them to build these horrendous towers. So again, this zone was one of the most heavily damaged given its closeness to the port and the epicenter of the blast. And you see here some of those images. Recent images show, of course, already people moving in to secure the structures to make sure that they don't fall apart in waiting basically for the big funds to come to allow them to restore them. At the very end of Guru Street, where this juncture with the Mar Mikhail district, you had basically historic mansions like these two beautiful buildings, and you see the kind of before and after situation, which is quite sad, quite tragic for really this historic heritage that we have. So Mar Mikhail is contiguous to Gemmayzeh. It is basically the extension of the same avenue that used to lead out from Beirut all the way to the eastern part of the city, beyond this, the city basically to the other suburbs. And the Rue Gouraud, which is the main artery through Gemmayzeh, basically turns into Rue An-Nahr at some point, which was later changed into Armenia Street. And the main sort of reference in that neighborhood was the St. Michael Church, hence the designation of Mar Mikhail for this district. This district was a mixed working class neighborhood, which was populated largely by migrants from the Mount Lebanon, as well as some of the Armenian population that fled basically around the turn of the century. And it was a kind of very rich neighborhood with different artisans, small industries. A view from 1965, a photo shows the lively character of this neighborhood on a Palm Sunday, with, of course, the arrangement of 3 to 4 stories, traditional houses and modern buildings, all forming a continuous street facade. This situation, remained up until very recently, like 5 or 6 years ago, when the developers started, who first basically jumped on Ashrafiyeh as the hot item to develop, then moved towards Gemmayzeh, and later the last sort of district to fall into this game was Mar Mikhail. And you see there are also modern heritage building in Mar Mikhail, like this 5 to 6 story interesting building that you see here. So this area was also quite heavily damaged, and the first efforts consisted of, as I said, securing the structures, assessing the damages before starting the reconstruction process. Many NGOs and private companies jumped in to kind of participate, but the main challenges remain securing the needed funds for the reconstruction phase. And I'm sure Mona is going to touch on that issue. As in Gemmayzeh, as I mentioned, the process of gentrification also started here, albeit a bit late. And many developers moved in to build mid to high-rise residential buildings, taking advantage of the lax regulations and the absence of urban guidelines. So towers like this one start to mushroom throughout the zone, which initially attracted art and entertainment businesses precisely because of its low density and tight urban fabric. So, these people move in because it becomes very attractive as a place because of its character, and then slowly they erode this kind of character in the process of their gentrification. As Leila Kabalan also noted in her article in Executive magazines about 4 years ago, 55% of the residents of the zone were low-income residents who didn't own their homes, and thus the gentrification process posed the real threat of displacing them outside of the city. This is part of her essay that you can maybe check later on. So the second district is Ashrafiya. Ashrafiya sits on a hilltop, basically overlooking the lower residential areas of Gemmaisi, Mar Mikhail, and the port. And it became basically the selected place for the aristocracy and the high bourgeoisie of the old city. When the walls came down, they started to move into this area and build their mansions in this area. This is why the neighborhood boasted a large number of historic buildings, which of course were replaced by towers over the last 4 decades. The public stairways that connected this neighborhood to Gemmaisi and Mar Mikhail, which sits at the bottom of the hill, also became important sort of public spaces, and some of them kind of opened up to become restaurants and cafes. The picture that you see here shows on the left the before and after of the explosion, but on a positive note, the picture to the right shows the recent shot I took about a week ago, and you see the resilience of people basically reopening the restaurant, cleaning up the stairs, and kind of trying as much as they can to bring life back to this neighborhood. This area has received great attention, of course, due to the lavish mansions that it has along Sursuk Street. Sursuk is one of the richest families that used to basically have financial interests in the port of Beirut, as well as in Egypt and in Palestine and other areas. So they were a very big sort of entrepreneurial family. And of course, they most of the family members basically built their mansions along the street, which of course received a kind of a large part of the explosion effect. And this shows basically one of the big mansions of the Sursuk family, completely devastated. The Sursuk Museum, of course, it was a mansion before. It was a house for one of the families, and was turned into a museum that was also damaged during this explosion. Other buildings belonging to other families of the high bourgeoisie of Beirut were equally devastated, and there have been efforts, of course, by different associations, NGOs, to help in at least securing those things and safeguarding them from the coming winter elements. But again, I would say, let us not overlook the damage that high-rise towers had already made on this district, without any respect for its historic nature, and sometimes in clear violation of urban guidelines. You see here one of those encroaching towers that has been built almost in the backyard of one of the old mansions of the Sursuk district. The third part, and last but not least, I would say, is Karantina. This is the district that lies north of the main highway leading to Beirut and to the port of Beirut, and in very close proximity to the port area. This zone grew out of basically the installation there of the quarantine hospital at the beginning of the 19th century. Then also the placement of the French military barracks after World War II. And later, of course, it developed into a zone of mixed use of low-income housing as well as some industries. So do you see how, again, it is Karantina, which is part on some maps of the Medawar district, shows how closely it is to the Beirut explosion, about 600 meters really from the epicenter. Now, the reason, of course, that this zone did not receive as much sort of visibility in the press is it's a very low-income neighborhood and basically home to migrants from different countries as well as low-income families from other parts of the country. Still, of course, some people have sort of shed some light on the situation here, and this is an article on the forgotten residents of Karantina. Of course, some images showing the devastation also in this zone and the, in some cases, complete devastation of the homes of these poor families. So, in summary, if I want to maybe add a note of optimism after this big catastrophe, I would put it in the form of a question. Are we really moving towards a new awareness of our urban heritage? The outcry, the public manifestation of solidarity, of basically the awareness of the historic nature of these neighborhoods has really prompted, of course, the authorities to put a hold, put a freeze on any development right now, any selling of demolished houses, so that there would be a period of assessment and a period when we look at this urban heritage with fresh eyes. Already, of course, in the local press, we had, in the French press, the Arabic press, we had a lot of articles also on this issue of the preservation of Lebanese heritage, the preservation of the identity of Beirut. And it even reached, Arc Daily, architectural websites. It has percolated to the international media and international associations. And of course, the international press, especially the French press, has been very kind of vocal about this issue. So out of this debacle, one maybe summary picture is there have been a kind of ad hoc approach towards what to do with this situation because of the lack of trust nationally and internationally in the official authorities. There have been a kind of like mushrooming of NGOs and different groups that are trying to collaborate and work together to preserve this heritage as well as help the people who are involved. And out of this conglomeration or of different NGOs, a new initiative took place called Beirut Heritage Initiative, which is attempting basically to bring these different groups under one umbrella. Finally, I would say that this could be a turning point in countering the greed of the big economic interests that destroyed the city and its heritage through uncontrolled speculation over the past 3 or 4 decades and led to the eradication of our cultural heritage. But August 4 will remain in our memory as a day of infamy, as a great, really moment of maybe shifting the balance. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Eddie. Now we're going to turn to Professor Haddad, to Professor Harb from AUB.
Okay, hi everyone, and thank you very much for having me at this event. It's a pleasure to be in such good company. I'm going to start, and you're going to see that there are some intersections in the first part of my presentation with what Professor Haddad mentioned, but I'll try to not to be very redundant. So first, I want to say that this presentation is the result of many discussions and ongoing works I'm undertaking with my colleague Mona Fawaz, and it includes the input of colleagues and researchers at the AUB Beirut Urban Lab, the Urban Lab, which is part of the Maroun Sem'an Faculty for Engineering and Architecture. So
Mona, I don't want to disrupt, but we are seeing your presenter view. Is that what you intended?
No, actually, this is, you want me to, yeah, let me check this. On Mac, do I have other options? Let me, I think this one, right? Is this the one?
No, we're, I mean, it's okay.
Yes.
We can see your presenter view. But
oh
this
yes,
is not...
that's a button. Yeah.
Yes, now it's good. Thank you. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Ezra. Okay, so so starting off, as many of you in this audience probably know, the August 4 explosion that rocked the port of Beirut resulted in massive losses in terms of human lives, and I need to mention that we're close to 200 women, men, and youth and children who were killed by that blast, and over 6,000 who were injured. The Order of Architects and Engineers estimates that 6,000 buildings have been damaged, of which more than 100 have a heritage value. This amounts to about 5,000 housing units in a 2-kilometer radius that extends through half of the city. It affects about 300,000 people. These are some numbers just to put a scale to what we're talking about. As you've seen in the presentation of Elie, the most affected areas are Jamaica, Karantina, Marim Khail, Jaitawi, Saint Nicolas, Leblat, and downtown Beirut. And some neighborhoods have sizable damages as well. Most of these areas, again, as Elie wonderfully explained, embody extensive layers of experiences and memories for many Lebanese and expatriates who live inside and outside Beirut, and for many members of the Lebanese diaspora, and many of them are here with us today, who visit this country regularly. So there's a lot of connection to people and to places who we experience in these neighborhoods, and the losses that are incurred, they reverberate across many of these people and places, well beyond Beirut, I would say, and they connect the wide community in deep grief, in a collective deep grief. So what I will do today is mainly share with you two sets of reflection. These are some maps that show you the extent of the blast. This is taken from the NASA satellite imagery. And this is one of the maps that are being shared by the Order of Engineers and Architects in Beirut that try to assess the extent of the blast across the mostly touched neighborhoods of Karantina, Marim Khail, and Jamaica down to the river of Beirut that you see to the east. So in this talk, what I will do is share with you two sets of reflections. One which underscores the fact, a point that was raised by Elie, the fact that we have heavy urban legacies and trends that compound the post-blast situation we're in. And the second will focus more on the governance of the post-blast recovery process. What are the recovery responses to the blast? What is the state doing? What are organized actors doing? Where does this put people at? And what does this tell us about the role of the state in the process and the potential outlook of recovery in Beirut? In closing, I will share very briefly what we're doing at the Beirut Urban Lab and how we're trying to inform a process of recovery that is fair and inclusive. So starting off, as you probably heard by now, the blast is not really a ground zero in Beirut. It's a disaster that comes on neighborhoods that have been experiencing instability for a number of years now, if not decades, depending on how historian we want to be. So More specifically, we've identified 5 sets of urban trends that have been transforming Beirut over the past years and that heavily impact its neighborhoods, including the ones hit by the blast. So the first, you've heard about it already, and I will not go back there again, is gentrification. So gentrification started in downtown Beirut, but then moved to Mar Mikhail and Jamaica specifically, and even Karantina is experiencing the influx of real estate changes. The second is abandonment, which is this trend where we have a lot of dilapidated buildings and physical structures throughout Beirut that are left to themselves. And several of these date back to the Civil War and are probably associated to the multiplicity of ownership that is associated to them. But in many cases, and as the work of Mona Fawaz and her team at the lab shows, abandonment is pretty much due to the speculative investment of developers that are waiting for a recovery of the real estate market to reinvest in their demolition and their replacement. The third is vacancy. And again, vacancy is a main outcome of the compiled effects of speculative investments in Beirut. And here we're referring to vacancy of both of abandoned units and unsold units, and there are many of them in Beirut. So again, according to the Beirut Built Environment database of the Beirut Urban Lab, the vacancy rates in the city since 1995 are as high as 56% in downtown Beirut and the port area and 23% in Mar Mikhail and Jamaica. So this is a vacancy that's directly caused by the initiatives of real estate developers, expats, and other investors to place their money in real estate. And in addition, this vacancy is facilitated and enabled by building regulations that exempt empty apartments from municipal and property taxes. The fourth dimension is, or trend is the loss of heritage and of urban character. So in addition to the fact that we're losing buildings that have a heritage value, we're also losing streetscapes, we're losing businesses that have a heritage component, craftsmanship, public spaces and gardens in the city, and all this is part of the speculative building activities that move them out. This also leads to a shifting of the local economic cycle to from one that is locally embedded in neighborhoods to one that is much more speculative, transnational, that links to international flows of capital, that is asset-based, and that is associated to the ownership of typically luxurious buildings. So in this context, the buildings with historical value that remain becomes the site of negotiations. And here I'm pretty much referring to the works of Huwaida al-Harithi on that, who teaches us that the argument becomes more about what is valuable to keep and how many we can keep, rather than thinking about heritage in an integrated way that links to its various layers at the social and economic level. The fifth trend I want to highlight is impoverishment and this loss of livability, which has been deeply aggravated over the years, especially since the beginning of 2019, with the beginning of the economic crisis and the slowdown. And then it has been compounded by the financial meltdown that Mustafa explained well in the beginning, and with the COVID-19 pandemic, of course. So we're in a situation where levels of socioeconomic inequality are soaring, with numbers that place the richest 10% owning more than 70% of all personal wealth in the country, and with levels of poverty reaching more than 50% of the Lebanese population. So this translates in the built environment and a multiplication of urban pockets of poverty throughout many neighborhoods, and we find this too in the devastated neighborhoods post-blast. So with this in mind, I'm going to move to a review of the actors of the recovery and try to reflect a little bit on this governance of post-blast recovery. So as you probably heard or seen, there are multiple actors that hurried to provide relief and aid in the aftermath of the blast in a very spontaneous way, but people got organized as the days and weeks went by. So these include political and religious organizations, but there are not as many as we imagined, and we're still looking into this. So I will not reflect much on the roles of political parties and religious organizations and focus more on the more visible actors on the scene. So we categorize the actors of the recovery in 4 groups, in addition to the state actor, of course, which I'll discuss in a bit. So the first group is that of UN agencies and INGOs, international non-governmental organizations. So UN bodies and INGOs have been very present in Lebanon for a while, some since the civil war, but there are a few. But they've mostly entered the Lebanese scene in the aftermath of the Israeli war on Lebanon in 2006. And they got very much consolidated with the Syrian refugee crisis that overwhelmed Lebanon as of 2011. So they're now an established staple, I would say, of the humanitarian scene in Lebanon. And they have quite an elaborate infrastructure of relief across the country, including UN-led coordination groups, refugee registries, and intervention protocols that are organized in the typical silos that are shelter, wash, water and sanitation and hygiene, security, education, health, and food and basic needs. So we see that there has been a shift from this infrastructure that was in place to the relief scene that is post-blast, and the repurposing of the roles of many of these INGOs to serve the post-blast recovery while maintaining the same structures of work that they had put in place for the Syrian refugee crisis. The second group are more the local non-governmental organization, and here we have a very heterogeneous bunch. So this includes some organizations that are affiliated to political foundations, to political parties, so the political foundations, some faith-based organizations, a big group of veteran NGOs that have been operating since the Civil War, and they have and these have a very strong developmental agenda. And then we have a new group of recently established NGOs that was mostly established in the beginning of the economic crisis. And I would distinguish this group through their very interesting relationship to the Lebanese diaspora. And here we're talking about an organized Lebanese diaspora that we're seeing in the UK, in the US. I'm referring to Impact Lebanon, Life and Seal. And these are organized groups that are increasingly able to fundraise and crowdfund and support the works of these new NGOs. So there's something there happening that's very interesting to document and to think of. The third are the activist groups, and as their name indicates, these are very much related to activists who have a strong political stance against the political sectarian regime in Lebanon. And these are people that have been mobilized in various instances as far as 2006, some of them in the aftermath of the Israeli war, and in 2011, in the echoing the Arab Spring, up to the garbage crisis of 2015, the municipal elections in 2016, the parliamentary elections in 2018. So we have a variety of groups who have been mobilized and have been consolidated and who have a link to the built environment, I would say, and who are interested in environmental issues, ecological issues, heritage issues that have been operating with a strong political discourse. Again, against the regime. This is how we're categorizing them. So these have mobilized and they are intervening on the scene of the devastated neighborhoods. Some are intervening to repair homes. Of course, the heritage preservationist groups that Elie mentioned are one of them. I'm not very sure if I put them there or local NGOs. It would be interesting to discuss this further if anyone is interested in these typologies. But most of them are more, I would say, keen on carving that space of sharing and collective recovery. So we see in their initiatives a lot of echoes to what we used to see in downtown Beirut. So the establishment of these soup kitchens, legal advice counters, mental health clinics, art therapy workshops. So there is the spirit where, you know, we take over the street, we put a tent, and we try to connect with the neighborhood communities. Some of these neighborhood initiatives also have a very strong grassroots dimension, and they are promising in that sense of that they might lead to a community group. In some cases, I'm mostly thinking about a group like Nation Station in Jaitawi, which has squatted an abandoned gas station and is looking into ways to further institutionalize its work. So overall, as you hear from my presentation, these interventions are quite unequal in their scope, and they vary in their respective visions and approaches, and they're very limited in funds, although they are receiving some funds, but the needs are much more than what they're receiving. The fourth group is the one formed by professional syndicates. So we have here the Order of Engineers and Architects, which I mentioned. There's also the Order of Contractors, the Bar Association, and many academics who are mobilized either alone or in relation to NGOs, but I would put them in that cluster because of their expertise. So here the efforts of these syndicates were aiming originally to put in place a viable coordination body, but it didn't really work because of the interference of political parties and their elected boards. And the two of them, the Order of Engineers and Architects and the Syndicate of Contractors, are now part of a committee that was just formed last week by the parliament to coordinate the reconstruction process. I'll come back to that in a few seconds. So these syndicates have been also working on the ground. So overall, despite their vibrancy, I would say that these actors form a fragmented, incomplete, and uncoordinated response to recovery. They do not have effective communication channels with the residents, who remain mostly unsettled about the safety of their homes. They're misinformed about which organization was assigned to fix them, what is the competence of or trustworthiness of this or that organization, and what is the process, most importantly, set in place for repair. And this is mostly coming from fieldwork we've been conducting in these neighborhoods in the last weeks. So moving on, where is the state in all of this? What is the state doing? So in the first few days after the blast, the Beirut Governance Office, which is the decision-making body of the Beirut municipality, appealed to 4 large-scale engineering companies, the same ones we always use, and asked them to conduct rapid surveys, and they did that quickly and pro bono. And the Office of the Government was overwhelmed with the requests and issued some ad hoc decisions. The municipal council also tried to position itself. They distributed some brooms to the volunteers that were going to clean up. They did some gestures of solidarity, some social aid in a very opaque procedure as expected, and that was about it. More prominent was the role of the Higher Relief Council, which is a committee that is headed by the Prime Minister with representatives of several ministries, that was set back during the time of the Israeli war on Lebanon in 2006, whose role is to conduct damage assessment and support the channeling of foreign aid to Lebanon. Again, they did little. They issued some announcement and they called on people to prepare files in paper format with pictures printed and submit them to get compensation from the government. The most salient response comes from the army. So the army stepped in, it took offices in the municipal building, and it's imposing itself today as the coordination body on the ground. It's requiring all recovery actors, including international organizations, to register with this office, and it's allocating them with neighborhoods, sub-neighborhoods where they can work. So this map shows you the division of the area of the blast in clusters and geographic zones, and each color of these zones have been assigned to INGOs and NGOs based on a formula that seems to be mostly piloted by the army, but we've also heard in recent interviews that it's also being coordinated with the UN coordination body, the OCHA. So we're still trying to understand these processes of decision-making and governance, but you can see how the army is trying to take hold of how the process of NGO allocation vis-a-vis geographic zones is happening. This is not working very well, actually, because many NGOs and community groups did not register with the army as they should have. Some small NGOs were assigned too large areas to work in, and conversely, the big NGOs had to wait several weeks before knowing where they're going to work, and sometimes they've been assigned zones that are too small relatively to their capacities. So again, here we see that residents are left out of these processes of decision-making. They don't really know who's responsible for their geographic area, and their relationship with the army is, they're quite wary of that relationship, especially the most vulnerable among them. They feel alienated by what they experience as a collection of, as intelligence gathering. More recently, the state formed a committee for the reconstruction. This was voted last week by the parliament, and we have now a committee of 6 public institutions, including the Higher Council for Relief, the Army, the Municipality of Beirut, the Director General of Urbanism, the Cadastral Directorate, and the Ministry of Culture, I believe in relation to heritage, and 2 syndicates, the contractors and the Order of Engineers and Architects, that have been tasked with the process of coordinating the post-blast construction. So let you watch this map a little bit while I finish up. So this committee has been tasked with surveying damages, with assessing losses, with channeling the compensation funds, and namely the main output of the law that was issued was to restrict land sales and protect tenants' rights over the duration of 1 year, renewable. So at the first reading, this might seem as good news, but this would be the case if you would trust how laws are issued and implemented in Lebanon. And as people who work a lot on these things, we do not do that at all. We know too well that laws are issued and implemented to serve the interests of the most powerful, and most of the time the real estate developers themselves. So indeed, that law fails to acknowledge the fact that there's a policy framework that incentivizes sales and displacement that remains in place, doesn't change. It also places the full load of recovery on residents themselves and limits the roles of public agencies to the assessment of the damage and to the channeling of compensation. It also recognizes that funds need to come from foreign aid and claim back the role of the HRC, the Higher Relief Council, as the main channel for that, although the Higher Relief Council has a disastrous reputation when it comes to corruption. Additionally, it assumes that the role of state is going to be contingent on this international aid, which is a huge question mark given the current framework of US sanctions on Lebanon. So in sum, the response of the state is pretty much concentrated in the security and military arm. It's also adopting dubious mechanisms of action. It's limited in scope to a top-down physical response to reconstruction and does not take into account an integrated process of recovery that would be co-produced with dwellers. It's a scenario that's detrimental to public life in the city, to people's everyday spatial practices, because mainly it is militarizing the built environment and public space, and it's creating the sense of fear that pushes people away from open spaces and from the streets, especially the groups that have intersecting vulnerabilities who are further criminalized in that process and further discriminated against. So in conclusion, I'm not going to be as hopeful as Eddie tried to be, unfortunately. So 2 months after the blast, as we sadly expected, as people who have been engaged in post-war recoveries for too many times, unfortunately, we cannot really speak of a recovery that is set on track towards social justice and accountability. The approach of UN bodies, activists, NGOs, and syndicates is uncoordinated and uncertain, while the takeover of the army and the Reconstruction Committee is not really promising. So in this context, how can we counter the army-NGOs tandem that seems to be imposing itself as the main option to lead recovery? This would impose a big burden on the activists and the professional syndicates who are trying to generate accountability, trying to support residents to take charge of their districts. These are huge responsibilities in very challenging times of compounding crisis that do not seem to be ending in any short sight, unfortunately. So in sum, the outlook of recovery is pretty bleak. But I mean, we live in a region where we are really condemned to hope. Yani. Palestine taught that to us many years ago, right? So we cannot do anything but try to work and try to inform the recovery to be as inclusive and as fair and as accountable as possible. And this is what we're trying to do in this Beirut Urban Lab of ours with an amazing team of people with whom we're trying to work on these 3 tracks I highlight here. So one in which we're trying to establish an observatory of the reconstruction, which would function as an open and access and shared information platform that supports, coordinates, and monitors damages and needs assessment, building on our own database that we've been working on. The second is seeking to advance urban recovery frameworks that are just, and doing that through pilot projects in 3 neighborhoods, Ma'al Mkhail, Karantina, and Jamaica, and possibly Jitawi as well. These would serve as case studies through which we can learn from and replicate, hopefully. And the third is a visioning exercise for the city in the post-blast period. We're doing that by engaging colleagues in the academia, in professional contexts, in and outside of Beirut. So let's see how things will fare for us. Thank you very much. And I'm sorry if I took a bit more time. I felt that I was extending a little bit. Thanks very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Ellie and Mona. We really appreciate these great presentations, highly informative. And now we will pass to the next section of our panel when recent graduates of Cornell will pose questions to our speakers. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce 2 ex-students. Eli Boutros is a recent 2018, actually, graduate of the BARC program at the Department of Architecture at Cornell University. He has worked at offices such as Hudu Susa and Olsen Kundig, and is currently an architectural designer at KPF. And Dona Mohsen graduated from the American University of Beirut in 2014 with a BArch, and then from Cornell University in 2018 with an MArch2. She lives in Beirut and recently founded her design startup by 510. So Eli and Dana, this floor is yours for your questions.
Thank you, Ezra. Thank you, Eddie and Mona, for the 2 exhaustive presentations, and thank you for all the work you've been doing, especially with the design, the Urban Lab. We're very lucky to have people like you advocating for our cities and our most vulnerable. I guess before getting into more direct questions, seeing that you're both educators, I wanted to start with like a question about the kind of pedagogical side of this issue outside of the US, outside of Lebanon too, seeing who might be joining us today. So pretty much immediately after the explosion, we started hearing talks about like architecture, educators wanting to do studios or design studios or things about Beirut immediately. And I guess I'd like to hear what you guys have to say about if you can think of methodologies or new approaches to how these design studios can be led that can be actually helpful to the efforts in Beirut, or that can be somewhat complementary to what's happening there, rather than just kind of keeping on with like fetishizing like destruction and aesthetics. So somehow using the resources people have around the world in their schools, and that kind of different approach maybe to help what's happening on the ground.
Do you want me to start on this?
Are we taking one question at a time?
I don't know.
Yeah, I think that would be good. Eli and Dana will alternate their questions.
Okay, Eli, go ahead, please.
Yeah, so, oh, sorry. That's the problem with 2 Elis.
Very interesting question. And, you know, assisted another webinar that was organized by colleagues in Egypt, the Syndicate of Architects of Egypt. And the first thing that people jump at these sort of situations is the idea of this provides an opportunity for our students to work on projects like this. And I'm personally, despite the fact that I'm in education, in academia, I'm a bit skeptical of taking this as an opportunity for, you know, a playful investigation that doesn't really do anything except add to the number of you know, surveys and people that these poor citizens have to encounter, the number of people who go, you know, taking photos and talking to them and all this. And in the end, you know, I think this is a matter that is really at a much larger scale than, you know, specific studios or projects. Saying that, we, you know, in our school, we're not preventing some studios from tackling this issue. And, you know, specifically, we have, you know, different sections of final year of the BARC program, which is also a 5-year program, looking at those zones of Karantina specifically, but also Jamaica and Mar Mikhail. Now, I think personally, if I were to give a studio on this, the areas of Jamaica and Mar Mikhail do not provide a great opportunity for other than historic preservation and looking how we can bring back this heritage together. But the area of Karantina may be fertile ground for really rethinking this zone. And if we want to reintroduce low-income housing, to do it maybe in a way that would be more sort of beneficial for the people living there, because they were not living in ideal conditions. So, you know, this is my personal take on this issue. I don't know if Mona agrees or not.
Yeah, of course, I do agree. I'm very much aligned on what you said, Eddie. I think we're getting a lot of you know, requests from colleagues, alumni abroad, asking us such a question, and it's hard to answer because people are very engaged. And as I said in the beginning, there's a sense of collective grief that people want to address by trying to help as much as they can, wherever they can. It's very hard to help if we don't have access to the field, I feel. And I'm also wary of, you know, this outpour of support that comes in under the disguise of expertise, like as if people abroad have expertise and they can transfer it to the natives. So I'm always very cautious about how to navigate that terrain because things change a lot in Lebanon since the early 1990s, and I would say even since 2006. We have an increasing number of urban programs that got established over the years that graduated amazing people, or people who went abroad and came back and established initiatives here. Sorry. So expertise is available, and I worry about that, and I'm starting to be honest about it when I speak to colleagues and tell them it's not really expertise that we need. But yes, we can enrich a lot what we're doing currently through conversations, through exchanges, participating in reviews. So we are responding positively to that. The methodology that would help a lot in a country where we don't have data is the collection of disaggregated data in the neighborhoods. So if we have local people who are able to work in the field and collect data, this is the thing we need most. We don't have socioeconomic data on many of the neighborhoods. We don't have tenure data about the neighborhoods. We don't know, we're still buying property deeds to figure out the history of plots here. So the data collection, disaggregated data collection for me is a key dimension that we need to fill. It's very hard to do it remotely, but for the architecture schools and urban programs that are in Beirut, I really hope they would engage in these processes of data collection, and we find a way to share the data. This is one of the functions that we want to try to do at the Urban Lab, is to collect as much data as possible, put it on that base map we have, and put it in open access for everyone to be able to work on. So I don't know if I diverted from that, but that data obsession is something that I think is, I mean, the more problems we face, the more urban issues we face, the more we feel that we need this data sets, these data sets that will inform the work.
Yeah, thank you.
Hi. So I just want to thank the panel first for the insightful and extremely critical discussion for an event that we're still trying to grasp and that we know has changed Beirut forever. So my first question is, so you mentioned the trust in the government. So with that trust in the government at an all-time low, and consequently the army and other related institutions, and the immediate and critical response was basically from volunteers and grassroots collectives that came together, what are, in your opinion, the pros and cons of the decentralized nodes as opposed to the typical top-down approach from the government?
Right. Yes, that's a difficult question to answer here. Thank you for it, Dana. I don't know, Eddie, would you like to try to take a stab at that?
Your territory.
Okay. The pros and cons. Well, there's a lot of pros with the, the people on the ground, right? They forge links with community groups, or they try to, at least they know better what's happening because they have this qualitative approach to data collection where they know exactly who's doing what where, or again, they're trying to grasp that. But we cannot just romanticize that and rely on it. Who protects the public interest? These NGOs, INGOs, activist groups on the ground, professional syndicates can do as much as claim for things, make claims, but they are making claims, they're assuming that there is a public body who's going to respond to these claims. So we are in a real dilemma, and I don't want to say absence of the state, because the state is here, but it's here in its military arm. It's here through its High Relief Council. So it's not absent, but it's here through institutions that do not put people at the center, that do not talk to dwellers, that do not talk with business owners, that do not talk even with INGOs and NGOs on the ground, or that talk with certain sections of the professional syndicates and not others. So we have to keep on pushing so they can hear, I would say, a wider diversity of opinions. It's very hard in the current climate, but this is what we need to keep on trying. Not to fall into a militarization of the process or over-centralization of the process, and then exclusion, especially of the most vulnerable groups, and the displacement from these neighborhoods. And, as far as I'm concerned, this is for me the real threat, that these neighborhoods are going to become empty. People will leave. They will just leave.
If I may add something to what Mona mentioned, I think maybe one of the positives of this kind of proliferation of NGOs that have sprung up to help is it gave people a little bit more hope than the kind of abstract process of a government that would come in and say, this is what you have to do, etc. But I want to clarify one thing, and I'm sure Mona agrees with me on this. The army did not choose to take over, and I'm not defending the army here, but they were basically entrusted by the government because it is the only institution left which has some semblance of non-corruption and some semblance of order. So they were entrusted to take over, and under emergency sort of decree, that this whole zone, they are the ones who can organize the relief efforts and everything else. But definitely they are not equipped to lead the reconstruction process, and they just don't have the expertise to do so. And this is where I think some of the syndicates, like the Order of Engineers and Architects, are starting to play a major role. Can they succeed? Will they be able to extract themselves from the game of commercial interests? That's a big if, that's a big question. And I'm not being naively optimistic about, of course, the prospects that await these zones, but I'm actually maybe out of this event, as well as others that have been happening all over the world, some maybe musical support events, others academic, that there's kind of international also effort to really accompany the Lebanese population and the Lebanese state in this reconstruction effort. But I want to say something that may sound controversial here. I'm not totally against the top-down approach. We have vilified this approach ever since Solidaire, ever since the 1950s urban reconstruction or urban renewals of Boston, New York, etc. But I think at some point in time, you know, this is why we have master's programs in urban design and urban planning. This is why we have experts. At some point in time, experts have to move in and say, you know, this is the way to do things. This is how we can approach the problem. And it's not only about, you know, the individual wishes. I mean, the individual wishes is what built Beirut in a kind of sort of completely ad hoc manner. And I think we need to, at some point, put in place really a more kind of expert approach to the issue of urban planning, taking, of course, into consideration what people want and taking the interest of the disadvantaged, the most vulnerable in the population into account, and making sure that we are not moving to displace people simply to give real estate a boom, you know. This is, of course, essential. These are principles, you know, that any society may choose to uphold or not. But in the end, I think we need sometimes a top-down approach to come in, and we are missing that right now. You know, this kind of sort of ad hoc-ish manner may as Mona mentioned, really create problems along the way.
May I jump in with a related question?
Sure.
I want to go back to the lessons learned or unlearned from the reconstruction process after the Civil War. I mean, Ellie, you in your talk, you mentioned how we know about the Solidaire, and a lot has been written about it, how they joined the playbook of neoliberal urbanization using architectural fame and famous architects to attract investors, to attract global attention, and the weaknesses or the destructive power of that greedy development is well known. And at the same time, for instance, Mustafa mentioned in his introduction that after the Civil War, there was no real transitional justice process. There was no real Truth and Reconciliation Commission. There was no real taking of accountability process. Like it was as if, you know, the Civil War, I mean, the Reconstruction in a way jumped into you know, business as usual too quickly without necessarily taking accountability for the past. And Mona, you also mentioned in your talk now that, you know, there's a similar lack of accountability process. There's a similar jumping into, I mean, of course, the reconstruction has to start. I mean, I'm not saying it should wait, but you mentioned how that lack of accountability, lack of transitional justice process may be a problem. So I wonder if in this question of what can international organizations do, what can local NGOs do, how can they actually join forces rather than seeing this as a top-down versus bottom-up thing? I mean, how can they actually reinforce each other? And trying to understand that, I wonder if you think that a transitional justice process where accountability for what really happened, who is responsible, what went wrong, whether that is actually an important process that is being sidetracked because there's so much to do.
I'll try to take a first stab at that. Well, transitional justice, this is I would say one of the main culprits of all the problems of Lebanon. So I totally agree with that. Unfortunately, 2 months after the blast, we still have no idea why the blast happened. So this gives you an idea about what is the status of accountability. People have not yet heard one public official explain the process through which the blast happened, what ignited the fire that caused the blast, why were nitrate ammonium placed in such haphazard way on the ports. So if we take that as a recent event, which did not prompt our rulers to change their the way they rule and to feel that they are accountable to people, I don't know what will change it. So we are in a real crisis of governance and of government and of social contract, where there's a big part of the population that feels completely alienated and excluded from political processes of decision making, and another part of the population that thinks the sectarian political system serves their interests and are defending that sectarian political system. And we are really in that, I would say, very difficult place of having to maneuver a very difficult conditions. How to work together with that? I think like-minded people who want to rebuild a state that is accountable, that people could trust, that is more people-centered, where public interest guides policymaking, where evidence guides policymaking. These people are trying to work together, and many of the activist groups have made real efforts in the past months to establish a common platform. NGOs and UN bodies are trying to liaise with a lot of experts. I think they're reaching out to people like Elie, like ourselves in the Beirut Urban Lab, and they're trying to see how they can engage us in that thinking process. There are things happening that do provide some shreds of hope, but I think we're so wounded and so disillusioned, especially my generation and Elise probably, that we're very cautiously hopeful when we see these things happening. We see them, but we've seen a lot of things happen before and just go to waste. So that's why, as far as I'm concerned, and I'm speaking really from my personal standpoint, I do what I think should be done to the best way possible. I try to influence the process to the best way possible, and I hope for the best, but the conditions are extremely difficult and the odds are really against these initiatives. So I'm also very carefully hopeful with regard to that. There's a lot of work that needs to be done. We're trying to do it, including transitional justice and that accountability process, which is essential to social justice. Having social justice as a goal incorporates that dimension for sure.
I will add just a few things about, because you kind of, Ezra, you quizzed me a little bit on Solidaire, and I will be maybe sound controversial here. 20 years ago, I was one of the vocal critics of Solidaire and this whole approach to urban planning. But you know, in hindsight, you see that Solidaire kind of cleaned up, removed half of the heritage, half of the historic areas of Beirut, including Martyr Square and all that, and the souks, and completely kind of rebuilt them in a new fashion, but also preserved 50% of the existing heritage around Rue Foch and that zone. So, you know, maybe what was missing in Solidaire was a little bit more modesty in terms of their approach, maybe incorporating really representation from the property owners who owned these places, etc., and kind of acting like grandfathering them into the process rather than sort of expropriating everything and then giving them just shares. So it was not a fair process, definitely. It was not a very kind of just towards the owners and towards the local community. It definitely tried to create a new image of the city that was sort of prepped up, and therefore, you know, it was kind of a lost experiment in a way that could have gone better. But we should look at the positive aspects of it. If it had been left to the individual property owners to develop on their own, it might have just been like the rest of the city and with towers everywhere and all that. So I think they've done something wrong, something good, and they've done some things that are wrong. And it was all part of a kind of political effort to wipe the slate clean, to forget about the past and say, you know, we turn the page, we are all brothers and sisters again, and we kind of move forward. Definitely this was tied to a certain agenda. But today, from where we are, I mean, I would miss to have something like that, maybe fine-tuned to the, you know, and taken into account lessons that are learned from that process and kind of implementing that. We're far from the optimism of 1992, unfortunately.
I'd like to follow up, I guess, linking this to the data collection aspect Mona was talking about, as well as the decentralization and like giving legitimacy to all these decentralized kind of entities doing the work. But going back to the Soledad, I guess from my understanding, also part of the data collection that Soledad had done with Oger and like surveying the demolition and destruction kind of extension was also somewhat exaggerated to allow the demolition of more lots than necessary. And thinking back of what's happening now, I think one of the reports mentioned that there's already multiple surveys of the destruction happening at the same time. So collecting the same kind of data, different ways between like the Higher Relief Council or the order. And they're both technically, you say like skilled professionals or trained. But at the end of the day, how do we give legitimacy to, I guess my first question is, why would we have different kind of surveys from different people of the same data? And secondly, how do we give legitimacy when at the end of the day, also that's what Mona's talking about power, and people in power are going to legitimize the data that kind of allows them to make the arguments they want to make. So I'm just not sure, with the data collection happening on multiple scales and from multiple entities, how do we kind of navigate that and validate which ones to go with?
Thank you for very compelling questions, really. These are all keywords for me. It's very important questions to ask. Why do we have multiple survey assessments happening and needs assessment happening? It's a very good question. Because these organizations work in silos, and you know, part of the way they do their work is to collect data. They're also, you know, tasked with these duties. So we have a first damage assessment that happened, that was commissioned by the Army. Then the Order of Engineers and Architects undertook another damage assessment, and then you have NGOs who need to do damage assessment to be able to work, and NGOs who also need to do their own damage assessment to work. And everyone, you know, just started doing this damage assessment because that's the first thing you do to be able to work. And the labor of coordination is too tedious. So I know that, you know, we called some people doing a damage assessment and tried to tell them, you know, we have a georeferenced map of municipal Beirut. We can give you the layers on GIS and just enter your data on it, on our map, and we'll share it in open access for everyone. Some people reacted positively, some people never followed up, some people just started their own. The Lebanese diaspora is also doing its own georeferenced map as well, so we're trying to link with some of them. But it's just too hard to coordinate when you're an individual or a small organization. You know, you would expect that the municipality of Beirut should have an already established socioeconomic data set of its city and its neighborhood, and that it mobilizes this knowledge to serve the city when a disaster happens, of the scale of what happened. But we don't. I mean, one of the major reasons we did the municipal base map of Beirut at the lab is because we kept on looking for one that's clean, and we never found it. And we said, okay, we're going to do it ourselves, khalas. And, you know, we spent 2 years just working on this base map because the municipality doesn't have it. And the people who are working in architecture and urbanism does not have access to a base map. So we just said, like, we'll just do it and we'll just share it with everyone, because exactly what you said, data is power. Because if we are able, as activists, as urban activists, as professionals who care for the public good of our cities, to produce this data and to share it, we think we are doing that labor that the municipality or the state should be doing. And if they're not doing it, maybe we do it, and then we can, at some point, reclaim the spaces of the state where this should happen. So there is a theory of change that is very much, I would say, informing our work, and not only our work at the Urban Lab, the work of many urban activists and environmental activists we liaise with. And I think even the work of a lot of the Lebanese diaspora who's using these same methodologies that you're talking about. So we want to be able to counter the narrative of the state or the politician who comes and say, this is the only way to rebuild, or we need to rebuild this way. We want to be able to say, actually, no, there are other ways to rebuild, because in this neighborhood, you have X people who own their house, X people who are tenants, X people who pay their rent in dollars, X people who pay it in Lebanese. And if you want to keep them there, you actually need to give cash subsidies to keep the people there. We need that level of knowledge. This is the level of knowledge we're trying to collect. We're not trying to collect to make damage assessment. We're trying to collect data related to property and tenure rights, because for us, what will keep people there is the ability to pay their rents at the end of the month. And this is a real issue today with the Lebanese lira devaluation and the economic crisis and the dollarization of our economy, to use Dan Aziz's term. So yes, I don't know if I answered you, but I think legitimacy is very much part of that. We legitimize, I think, ourselves by this data production. We also claim a place for us to debate, to negotiate, to ask, to claim, because we have data. This is what we're trying to do in our conversations with NGOs, UN bodies, with the governor when Fawaz speaks to him, with the syndicate of engineers, with the order of engineers and architects, where when we discuss with them how do we join forces. We're using our platform as a data production unit, and a unit who cares for sharing the data and open access.
All right, I think we have about 20 minutes left. There are a few questions from the audience that I would like to bring in. Some of them you've already at least partially answered, because the two presentations were incredibly rich. So I am gonna present some of the questions. I'm gonna kind of collect some of them and put them into kind of like a thematic way. If you wanna get deeper into some of the issues that you've already discussed through these questions, please feel free to do so. So we have a question from Carlos. We actually have several questions from Carlos. I've chosen one of them, and the question is with regards to land ownership. So he said that different factors have been highlighted, but land ownership was not one of them. How does it factor into what's happening in those particular neighborhoods, and then the recovery effort? I'm not sure who would take this, but Mona or Eli, whoever feels more comfortable going for it, please go ahead.
Again, it's a question of doing really data surveys that sort of give you an accurate view. And in terms of the Mar Mikhael district, for example, 55% of people who reside there are tenants who pay rent. So they don't own their buildings, and the buildings are largely owned through private individuals. And by the way, this is an issue we didn't highlight, is the fact, the state has been also dumping the issue or the problem of subsidizing low-income families on these old owners of old buildings. So rents have been for 20 years frozen, and they cannot raise them. And sometimes people would be paying the equivalent of $100 a year for a flat in the middle of Beirut. So there's a lot of injustice that has occurred for both the owners and the tenants who are kept in this precarious condition. Finally, about 2 years ago, they agreed on a new law that kind of frees the situation, but it will result definitely in the renters being pushed out of their homes with very little prospect of any kind of remedy for their fate. So this is another, this adds another problem, basically, which now we are facing, because the owners of these old buildings that have been damaged are saying, you know, we don't have any money to fix the building. So if the person living there, the family living there, doesn't have money to fix it themselves, they're out on the street. You know, they are evicted de facto by the event that happened.
Great. Mona, do you have anything to say about this, or should I move on to the next question? Okay.
You can move on, Mustafa, sorry.
No worries. So we have a question by email. I'm getting it from different factors here. It's really interesting. I feel like I'm an anchor. So we have a question from Ziad Mutran from Marm Khail. He's an architect, and he has a very specific architecture-related question that I would like to ask you. So he's saying, how will the heritage be saved? Of course, we talked about this in a general way, but it's talking about specifically about the fact that people are using, because they need to get into their houses and have doors and windows for as the winter is coming up and cold is coming in, they have to go with aluminum or whatever material they can in order to replace the old, beautiful wooden shutters and so on. So he's asking, are there any short-term strategies to control these short-term responses? And what is the way to do so with action and not words? I'm not sure we can answer that, but I'll put that out there. And is there any need for temporary solutions that would hold up these kind of, Band-Aid solutions that would allow us to actually rebuild in a way that is sensitive to the heritage or the architectural heritage?
Mona, you want to take this? No? Well, I think the DGA, which is the Directorate General of Antiquities, has also been an active player in this, although it's a public institution, and it has mainly been involved in addressing the historic buildings of these districts. Now, do we have guidelines for the exact kind of or guidelines and directions for people to restore their buildings? We don't have that. And unfortunately, what Ziad is mentioning has been happening all over historic towns. You have people replacing their beautiful wooden frame for windows and doors by aluminum because it's simply better insulation in the winter. So it's been happening throughout, and there's, the key is always the money. If you have the money and you have a strong sort of authority, central authority that gives people really aid and guidelines in restoring their houses, they would do it. But will small NGOs be able to handle this task? I'm not sure.
All right, thank you. We have a question about foreign intervention.
Can I just jump in here to build up on that same question? So
Please.
basically, regarding what you were talking about, I have, is there, regarding these like heritage buildings, we know that the buildings involved a significant level of craftsmanship and detailing when they were done. So knowing that some of these traditional crafts have been dying out or have become not as accessible, what is another approach we can take to deal with reconstructing these heritage buildings? And is a technological approach such as like digital fabrication or such an option in that case?
That's a great question. I'm not sure.
If you're
talking preservation and proper preservation, no, it is not. Can we substitute the wood trusses by steel trusses? Yes, we can, without really incurring a lot of damage to the appearance of a historic building. But I think there's still a lot of people, able craftsmen and people, in those trades who have also started to participate in a limited way in the, already in the reconstruction process. The skills are there in Lebanon. What we are lacking is a kind of central direction as well as the funding.
All right, thank you. There's an interesting question about open spaces. So I'm not sure, I mean, there are some open spaces in that neighborhood, the stairs and the beautiful, some of the smaller town squares. The question is with regards to who actually is taking care of the open spaces and making sure that they're maintained along with parks, green spaces, possibly even building new green spaces into it. And this comes from Renu. Do we know of any project like this? If there's nothing, just tell us there's nothing and we'll move on.
No, there are things. I mean, I think it's important to highlight that in cities like Beirut, and especially in these urban fabrics, public spaces are not, you know, your typical enclosed garden like you may see in other cities. So public space is the street pretty much. So especially the street of Mari Mikhail, Jemaize is an open public space for many. And I think people who know Beirut know what I'm referring to. But also, you know, we have dead ends, alleys, street corners that serve as places of gathering. We have a lot of shops, small businesses that play the role that public spaces play. They're meeting places for people to sit in and socialize and interact and gather. The stairs that you mentioned, Mustafa, that link Jaitawi to Mari Mikhail and Jemaize to Sursu are very important connection arteries, and some of them have hidden spaces that are also very patronized by a variety of people. So these spaces exist. They haven't been maintained for, I would say, for decades, and they're taken care of pretty much by, in very precarious ways, I would say, a little bit by the municipality, a little bit by people, and it gives them their charm because they're disorderly and messy and a little bit dirty. So, you know, it gives that cachet to a public space that is, I would say, that one identifies with in many ways. They're full of graffitis, etc. So these spaces are there, and as you showed in your beautiful pictures, Eli, some of them are being recuperated pretty quickly and cleaned up, and some tables and chairs are coming back. There were a couple of cultural events also, one in the street of Jemaize and one on the stairs of Mari Mikhail that claimed back the space as a cultural space for people. So Tayyib, the food market that happens, is now taking place every Thursday in Mari Mikhail. So there is an attempt to reclaim the space, and I would say even the NGOs mostly, and the activists are using these public spaces by installing some tents, some areas through which they provide their services. So public space is still very vibrant in many ways, and it's being reclaimed. I mentioned Nation Station in Jaitawi. The garden of the Jesuits in Jaitawi was a site through which food was distributed just in a week after the blast, and where a lot of aid got redistributed. So public space is there. Now, I'd like to mention that there is a very interesting project in these areas, which is the Fuad Butrus highway that was supposed to cut across these neighborhoods, linking the upper part of Ashrafiyeh to Shal Hello Highway, and which dates back to the 1960s. And one of the first activist movements had a big resistance against this project and proposed a counter project to it, which is to propose the Fuad Butrus Park instead. And I think if we want to talk about opportunities, if the blast is an opportunity for anything, I would say activating the Fuad Butrus Park in this area could be a very interesting initiative to be undertaken by professionals and activists with the municipality and the governance office, because these lands have been expropriated in their majority, and they include a lot of greenery and very interesting practices already there that can be thought about in a reconstruction effort. So I'll stop with that.
I want to just add that you're definitely right about all these places, but we're talking mostly about hardscape. And as far as green areas, we have a lack in Beirut as a whole. The Jaitawi garden that you mentioned, the Jesuit garden, the municipality has always very creative ideas about, you know, uprooting or removing those gardens to create parking underneath and then replanting supposedly. But of course, it would eat up half of the garden in the process. Sanaya has been desecrated this way, and then the project was stopped for financial reasons, I think. So, but we do have, maybe this provides an opportunity, not in the dense fabric of Jamaica, but actually in Karantina, where there could be a possibility really for a significant green park for the people who live there. Also, in connection to some of the other questions that were raised before, what kind of models can we maybe learn from if Solidaire is not a good model? I was just thinking the IBA initiative in Berlin in 1978 was a kind of private initiative, started as a private initiative by, I believe it was Hans Kohlhoff. And then it became sort of, it was voted by the Parliament of West Berlin at the time. And they gave him a certain fund to really launch a series of competitions around the West Berlin at that time, the vacant sites of West Berlin, and what to do with those vacant sites. And of course, there was no funding available to necessarily execute those projects unless a developer shows up and works on this lot according to the guidelines. And this could be a good way that I think the NGOs, and not necessarily the NGO, but the Syndicate of Engineers and Architects could step in, draw a set of guidelines, and then of course, if they are adopted by the government, by the parliament, these could become the guidelines for future growth and how to develop the area. And there was some discussion about really compensating people who own old houses and can, now need badly the cash to be able to restore their houses by selling the exploitation, whatever you call it, the exploitation rate that they have not used to areas outside of these historic districts. And that's a feasible way basically also to kind of come up with solution.
Yeah, may I just add one thing, since my recent book is on the IBA project that Ellie has just spoken. I mean, I hear you about the model of getting developers obey some of the rules that are set by, let's say, a group of architects and so on and so forth. But that process in itself did not necessarily avoid the gentrification and the displacement of the residents and so on. There was an additional layer of civil rights organizations and tenant organizations that avoided gentrification and displacement at one small area. I mean, the rest of the Kreuzberg, where this initiative happened, could not avoid necessarily the displacement of the residents. So I just wanted to say that that model also needs to be very, translated and transformed if it is to...
You know very well, there were two sides of the IBA. There was the new projects on sites that are vacant, but also there was an initiative to help people restore old buildings in which they were living.
So that part is
that
part is a more acute part in my opinion, but that took a lot of civil rights organization and bottom-up organizing to establish. The state was not necessarily willing to do that unless there was a pressure from the locals. Just
Absolutely.
as a side note,
I wanted to... pressure. If there's no pressure here from the population, we're not going to get anywhere.
Great, thank you. We have only 5 minutes left, so I'm going to try and actually combine a few questions into one. And for those whose questions I didn't get to, I apologize. There's tons of people asking questions now. Suddenly it's like going up my screen. I got whatever I can to try and do this. So we have a question from Gruya, Sarah, and Rebecca that I would like to kind of combine into one. And it's about it's related in a way, and it's about foreign intervention in many ways, on the political level and on the economic level, and also in terms of investors. So what does that mean? Post 2006, where did the money come from for Reconstruction? Post 1992, where did the money come down for Reconstruction? How did it impact the political landscape? And now lessons learned from those two incidents in terms of foreign. Who are we talking about foreign? We're talking about Gulf money, we're talking about Saudi money, and now we're talking about French and Turkish money. So I would like you, if you can, to try and tie together, especially that we got accusations that we're trying to avoid the political. I assure you we're not. I'm trying to get from you your take on the involvement of foreign governments, particularly, or foreign government agencies in the both kind of like coming in during this time to take advantage, but also in terms of the reconstruction and the money being poured in. Where is it being poured in? For whose benefit is it being poured in? Particularly when it comes to the main ones that we've been seeing recently. Of course, the French coming in every 5 minutes, and and especially with the history of the French being in Lebanon, very bad optics. It depends on how you look at it. But also, of course, as I said, there's Turks, there's Qataris, Saudis were not as present, but there's of course Iran, and so on and so forth. So I'm giving you the floor to try and bring in the political as much as you can, as it weighs onto the urban landscape and its reconstruction.
This is Mona's territory, but I would say we welcome any money wherever it can come from.
I'm sure with specific conditions. No money comes for free, right?
Yes, this raises the major issue of the economic system of Lebanon, which relies enormously on foreign flux of money and the production of rent rather than productive economy. And we're still reproducing that model through this recovery by relying on foreign, assuming that we will do something that will get us foreign funds through which we can restart this economic system and the recovery in addition. Even before the blast, this is what we were, we've reached a stage where we were thinking that the IMF is our solution. There was a consensus even among the most leftist activist groups that we will welcome the IMF just to get us out of our hole. So it's a big issue, and it places, it reminds us, your question reminds us that Lebanon is at the heart of these geopolitical intersections. At one point, it was Saudi and Syria and Iran, and now it's shifting more towards Turkey, Iran, and Saudi is playing like, I don't care about Lebanon. Qatar has already sent some money in. France is trying to position itself as a broker. US sanctions on Lebanon are affecting our everyday lives in amazing ways that we've never experienced before. So it's a very big, it's a very hard question to answer. What leverage do we have as people, as professionals, as academics, even as INGOs? I've sat in conversations between the World Bank and INGOs and UN bodies where they were trying to see how will they fund this multi-billion-dollar reconstruction? How will the money come? To whom? To which body in the state, when we have a state that has become so illegitimate today and that no one wants to fund because they're linking its funding to the disarmament of Hezbollah, or to a reduction of power of Hezbollah, or to a change in the sectarian politics of the Nizam, of the regime. So the equation is so complex with all these interferences that it's very hard to think about it at the local and neighborhood level, where I would say it's this there's these issues of scales and these issues of geopolitics. We haven't discussed them at all in this presentation, but of course they're very heavy and they weigh very heavily on all the decision-making process. And in that sense, yes, they merit another discussion with the IR people and the people who would be able to discuss these things at a level of discussion that I'm not very familiar with. I mean, I follow, but I'm not an expert on these matters.
Thank you very much. I think we're at the end. It's 11:30, so I'm gonna thank you and thank the audience, and I'm gonna turn it to Esra Ekcan for the last word.
I too would like to thank our panelists and attendees for this very important and informative discussion with varying levels of hope and despair, I would say, but still very, very inspiring against all odds. And I would also like to share with you our next event, Repatriation of Museum Objects between Europe and Africa on October 19, starting at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. You may register by following the link on our website. Again, thank you so much, and we hope to see you all in our next event. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your engagement with our work.